The text message came through at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening while I was still in my surgical scrubs, still smelling faintly of copper, iodine, and recycled air. It read exactly like this. Don't come to your sister's engagement party. You're an embarrassment. No apology, no explanation. Just two brutal sentences from the man who raised me, discarding me like a piece of hazardous waste. I read it 3 times before I understood he meant it. And somewhere deep inside the underground medical wing of the Pentagon, past 2 security checkpoints that knew my name, I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. The man had just erased my existence with the tap of a screen. Why? Because I did not fit into the glossy, perfectly curated image he was desperately trying to sell to my sister's wealthy new in-laws. For 22 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had stayed in the shadows. But this was a betrayal so profound it knocked the breath out of my lungs. How did it get to this point? How does a father look at his own flesh and blood and decide she is nothing more than a stain on the family portrait? I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect tears at a moment like this, and I did not have any to give. What I had instead was a strange settling calm. My name is Tamsin. I am 46 years old, and I hold the rank of colonel in the United States Army, serving as a senior trauma surgeon and a strategic medical advisor for the Pentagon. For the last 3 years, I have served in a classified advisory capacity, working alongside defense contractors and military generals on matters I am not permitted to discuss with anyone, especially my own family. To them, I was never anything more than the daughter who could not quite figure her life out. Not someone with a title worth repeating at a dinner party. Just a woman in her mid-40s who never married, never had children, and somehow never amounted to what my father considered success. My father, Harrison, evaluates human worth the way a banker evaluates a stock portfolio. He looks at the surface, the shine, the immediate return on investment. If you do not make him look good in front of his golf buddies, you do not exist. I had just spent the last 9 hours in an operating room, piecing together the shattered femur of a young soldier airlifted from a classified training accident. My hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of saving a life. There was blood on the cuffs of my pants. I was exhausted, aching down to the marrow of my bones, but I was proud. I was doing work that mattered. Then my phone buzzed on the metal counter of the locker room. I wiped my hands on a sterile towel, picked up the device, and saw his name. Harrison. Not Dad. I stopped calling him Dad in my head a long time ago. Don't come to your sister's engagement party. You're an embarrassment. I stared at the glowing pixels. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. The engagement party for my younger sister, Lorelei, had been the only thing my parents had talked about for 6 months. Lorelei is 29 years old, a public relations director for a boutique fashion brand, and the undisputed golden child of our family. She is beautiful, vivacious, and firmly believes the sun rises and sets strictly for her convenience. 6 months ago, she got engaged to Cashin Thorne, the heir to the Thorne Medical Group, a massive private healthcare empire. When she called to tell my parents, I heard the celebration through the phone. My mother's laughter, ice clinking in glasses, my father's booming voice talking about how she had finally secured their legacy. I had already requested the leave. I had already bought a dress, pale blue, modest, nothing that would draw attention away from my sister, because that has always been the rule in my family, spoken or not. Do not outshine Lorelei. Do not make this about you. I never minded following that rule. What I minded was discovering in a 2-line text message that I was not even welcome to stand quietly in the back. I put the phone face down on the bench. I unlaced my surgical clogs, my movements methodical, almost robotic. I did not text back. I did not ask why. I knew why. I was a gritty, tired, overworked doctor who dealt in blood and trauma. I did not wear designer clothes. I did not speak the language of country clubs and yacht parties. To Harrison, I was a peasant who would only muddy the pristine waters of the Thorne family's extreme wealth. I washed my face in the cold water of the locker room sink, watching the dark circles under my eyes in the harsh fluorescent lighting. I took a deep breath, letting the icy air of the subterranean facility fill my lungs. I walked out of the locker room, nodding to the armed guards who stood at attention as I passed. When I reached my private office, my secure terminal was blinking with a priority notification. A classified red folder had been delivered via encrypted courier. I sat at my desk, the heavy oak surface covered in medical logistics reports. I broke the seal on the folder. It was a massive procurement bid. Hundreds of millions of dollars in military medical equipment contracts for forward operating bases. The Pentagon needed my final strategic medical review to authorize or terminate the funding. I stared at the dense pages of technical specifications, letting the sheer gravity of my actual life wash away the sting of my father's text message. I had real work to do. I did not have time to bleed over a family that had spent decades holding the knife. People always ask why I stayed in contact with them for so long. Why do you keep answering the phone? Why do you keep showing up for holidays when they treat you like ghosts? It is a fair question. The truth is, trauma bonds do not break all at once. They fray, thread by miserable thread, over decades. My mind drifted from the procurement file on my desk back to the sprawling, silent museum of pain I carried in my head. Every artifact in that museum was a memory, a quiet confirmation of where I stood in the hierarchy of Harrison's heart. Exhibit A in my mental museum happened 20 years ago. My medical school graduation. I had survived 4 years of grueling, sleep-deprived hell to earn my degree. I was at the top of my class. I stood on the sprawling green lawn of the university, wearing my heavy black robe and the hood that signified I was officially a physician. Around me, thousands of families were screaming, crying, hugging their children, holding up signs and tossing flowers. I stood by a large oak tree alone. My parents did not come. Harrison had called me 2 days prior. He said the drive was too long, and the timing conflicted with one of Lorelei's youth ballet recitals. She was 9 years old. He told me that surely I understood, because a graduation is just a piece of paper, but Lorelei had a solo in the Nutcracker that she could not perform without her parents cheering in the front row. I stood on that lawn, watching other students fold into the arms of parents who had flown across the country. And I told myself it did not matter. I was good at telling myself that. Exhibit B was the $50,000 debt. When I was 30, I had finally saved enough money from my grueling surgical residency to put a down payment on a small townhouse. It was my escape hatch, my sanctuary. 1 week before I was supposed to sign the closing papers, Harrison showed up at my cramped apartment. He did not ask how I was doing. He sat on my cheap sofa and told me that Lorelei, who was 19 and had just dropped out of college, wanted to start her own boutique PR and styling firm. She needed seed money. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "It is your duty as the older sister to support her. You have a steady paycheck. She has a dream. Do not be selfish, Tamsin." He framed it as a loan. It was never a loan. I handed over my life savings because I was desperate for his approval, desperate for him to look at me just once and say, "Good job." I lost the townhouse. Lorelei spent the $50,000 on leasing a trendy office space and buying designer clothes for networking. She bankrupted the firm in 8 months. Harrison never mentioned the money again, and when I once dared to bring it up, he called me a petty, score-keeping cynic. Exhibit C, Thanksgiving dinner, 5 years ago. I had just returned from a brutal deployment in a conflict zone, setting up field hospitals under mortar fire. I was exhausted, my soul hollowed out from watching young men and women die on my operating table. I sat at the grand dining table in my parents' pristine suburban home. Aunt Sybil, Harrison's older sister, was holding court. She is a woman who wears too much perfume and thrives on inserting venom into casual conversation. She looked at me over her crystal wine glass and sneered, "So, Tamsin, still playing the battlefield garbage collector? Fixing up the broken pieces? I suppose it is a living, but it is hardly glamorous, is it? Not like our Lorelei, styling the mayor's wife last week." I looked at my mother, Rowena. My mother is an enabler. She has spent her entire marriage smoothing over Harrison's cruelty with forced smiles and fresh baked goods. Rowena just smiled, patted Lorelei's hand, and asked who wanted more turkey. No one defended me. I was the family punching bag, the designated failure used to prop up the illusion of their success. Why did Harrison hate me so much? It took me years of therapy to understand that he did not hate me. He feared me. I was independent. I was quiet. I possessed an intellect and a resilience that he could not manipulate. His entire sense of self-worth was built on control and appearances. Lorelei was a perfect mirror for his narcissism. She fed his ego, relied on his money, and performed the role of the beautiful daughter flawlessly. I was a mirror that showed him his own shallowness. My silence read as judgment to him. So, he punished me for it, year after year, death by 1,000 paper cuts. I sat in my Pentagon office, the cold air humming through the vents, and I realized something profound. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy a ticket to a game I was never going to be allowed to play. The text message on my phone was not just an insult. It was an eviction notice. And honestly, it felt like liberation. Have you ever tried to please a person who was determined to misunderstand you from the very beginning? Share your story in the comments below. I am reading all of them right now. I pushed the memories away, locking the museum doors in my mind, and focused on the heavy red folder resting on my desk. The procurement bid. This was my realm. Here, in the sterile, high-stakes environment of military strategy, my word was law. General Killian, a 3-star general who commanded immense respect across the armed forces, trusted my medical assessments implicitly. If I said a piece of equipment was flawed, the contract was dead. If I approved it, hundreds of millions of dollars flowed into the private sector. I flipped open the thick dossier. The Pentagon was seeking to overhaul the portable trauma stabilization units used by forward operating teams. These units were literally the difference between a soldier bleeding out in the dirt and surviving long enough to reach a field hospital. The contract was massive. $200 million. I scanned the list of bidders. The top contender, heavily favored by some of the politicians on Capitol Hill, was a company that claimed their new automated stabilization pods were revolutionary. I looked at the company name printed in bold black ink at the top of the page. Thorne Medical Group. I froze. I blinked hard, leaning closer to the desk, ensuring the harsh fluorescent light was not playing tricks on my tired eyes. But the letters remained unchanged. The CEO and principal owner listed on the executive summary was Octavia Thorne. It was a name I had heard 1,000 times over the last 6 months. Octavia Thorne was Cashin's mother. She was Lorelei's future mother-in-law. She was the matriarch of the Thorne Empire, a ruthless, ambitious woman who treated her family's healthcare business like a kingdom. According to Lorelei's endless bragging, Octavia was the ultimate prize, a woman of unimaginable wealth and influence, whose approval my father, Harrison, was practically breaking his back to secure. The irony hit me with the force of a physical blow. A dark, cynical laugh bubbled up in the back of my throat. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and stared at the ceiling. For the past half-year, my family had been twisting themselves into knots to impress the Thornes. Harrison had bought a new luxury car he could barely afford just to park it in the Thornes' driveway during dinner parties. He had forced my mother to take etiquette classes. He had curated the engagement party guest list with surgical precision, eliminating anyone who might make his family look less than perfect. He had eliminated me. He had texted me to stay away, calling me an embarrassment, terrified that my tired face and lack of a designer wardrobe would offend Octavia Thorne. He was groveling at the feet of a family whose entire financial future currently rested under the tip of my ballpoint pen. I looked back down at the file. The Thorne Medical Group was bleeding cash. I read through the financial disclosures attached to the bid. They had overleveraged themselves acquiring smaller tech firms, and their stock was dipping. This $200 million military contract was not just a bonus for them, it was a lifeline. If they secured it, their stock would skyrocket, cementing their legacy. If they lost it, the resulting financial crash could fracture their empire. And Octavia Thorne was relying on the anonymous strategic advisors at the Pentagon to push it through. She did not know the anonymous advisor was the sister of the girl her son was marrying. She did not know that the woman her future in-laws had just banned from the engagement party was the sole gatekeeper to her salvation. I traced the edge of the paper with my finger. The temptation to simply stamp "rejected" out of pure spite was a brief, burning flash in my chest. But I am a professional. I do not play games with the lives of soldiers. If the Thorn equipment was the best, I would approve it, regardless of my personal vendetta. I turned the page to the clinical trial data, determined to evaluate the stabilization pods with cold, clinical objectivity. I began to read the technical specs. The oxygen delivery system, the automated tourniquet pressure sensors, the biometric feedback loops. The deeper I read, the more a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. The numbers were too clean. The failure rates during the simulated stress tests were 0. In trauma medicine, nothing has a 0 failure rate. I grabbed a red pen and started circling discrepancies. The data was heavily manipulated. They had omitted the results from extreme temperature tests that simulate the blistering heat of a desert deployment. I was engrossed in cross-referencing their data with independent lab results when my personal phone began to vibrate violently against the desk wood. It was late, past 10 at night. I looked at the caller ID. Lorelei. She never called me. We had not spoken on the phone in over 3 months. When we did, it was usually her demanding a favor or complaining about a vendor for her wedding. Given the text message I had received from Harrison a few hours earlier, a call from her meant the family narrative was shifting. I pressed the answer button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello. How could you do this?" she screamed. Her voice was not just angry, it was hysterical, trembling with a raw, unhinged panic. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, startled by the sheer volume of her screech. "Do what, Lorelei? I haven't done anything. Dad told me not to come to the party. I am staying away. What exactly is the problem?" I kept my voice flat, refusing to match her chaotic energy. "Do not lie to me, Tamsin. Do not act like you do not know exactly what you did." She was hyperventilating, her breath hitching through the speaker. "You ruined everything. You did this on purpose to humiliate Dad. You are trying to destroy my wedding." I sat up straight in my chair, the Thorn medical file momentarily forgotten. "Lorelei, take a breath and tell me what you are talking about." "I have been in surgery all day." There was a muffled sound, like she was pacing frantically on a hardwood floor. "The broadcast, Tamsin. The national security broadcast. You malicious, jealous freak. Dad is losing his mind. Octavia is furious. The entire dinner was destroyed because of you." I stared at the red pen in my hand, my mind racing to connect the dots between her screaming, a national broadcast, and the Thorn family. What in the world was she talking about? "Start from the beginning," I demanded, my voice dropping an octave into the command tone I used in the trauma bay. "What broadcast?" Lorelei let out a jagged sob. "Last night. We were having an intimate dinner at the Thorn estate. Just me, Cashin, his parents, and our parents. Dad was doing so well. He was talking about his insurance agency, making it sound huge. He was impressing Octavia. We were drinking vintage wine in their private tasting room. They had the television on in the background, muted, tuned to some cable news network that covers Washington politics." I closed my eyes, a sinking feeling settling heavily in my chest. I suddenly remembered the press pool. Yesterday afternoon, General Killian had pulled me into a high-level briefing room to discuss medical logistics with a visiting coalition of Allied commanders. It was a formal affair. I had been wearing my full dress uniform, my silver eagles gleaming on my shoulders, my rows of commendation ribbons pinned perfectly to my chest. The press had been allowed in for exactly 3 minutes of B-roll footage. I had been seated directly to the right of General Killian, deeply engaged in a conversation with him about field hospital deployments. Octavia was talking about their new military contract, Lorelei continued, her voice dripping with venom. She was bragging about how she was trying to get a meeting with the Pentagon's senior medical strategists. And then she looked up at the television. My breath hitched. The camera zoomed in on the briefing, Lorelei cried. It showed General Killian. And right next to him, laughing with him like you were best friends, was you. In a military uniform. Covered in medals. The graphic on the bottom of the screen literally read, "Joint Chiefs consult with senior advisors." Octavia pointed at the screen with her wine glass. She looked at Dad and said, "Harrison, is that your eldest daughter? The one you said was struggling to find nursing work." I pressed my fingertips against my temples. The sheer, unadulterated chaos of the situation was almost comical. For years, Harrison had downplayed my existence to anyone who would listen. He told his country club friends I did paperwork for the government. He told Aunt Sybil I filed records. And apparently, to impress the billionaire Thorne family, he had downgraded me to an unemployed nurse, painting himself as the long-suffering patriarch burdened by a failure of a child. "What did he say?" I asked quietly. He panicked. Lorelei screamed. He turned completely white. He choked on his wine. He tried to laugh it off and told Octavia it must be a look-alike. He swore up and down that you did not work at the Pentagon, that you were just a low-level civilian temp who probably wandered into the wrong room and got caught on camera. But Octavia is not stupid, Tamsin. She paused the television. She zoomed in on your name tag. She saw the rank insignia. I could picture it perfectly. The pristine tasting room, the tension thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Harrison, trapped in a web of his own pathetic lies, sweating through his expensive suit while Octavia Thorne, a woman who built an empire on ruthlessness, stared him down, realizing she was about to marry her son into a family of liars. Cashin's father asked Dad why he would lie about his daughter being a decorated military officer, Lorelei said, her voice cracking. Dad couldn't answer. He just kept stammering. Octavia put her glass down and said, "Families who hide things from us at the start tend to keep hiding things later." She told Cashin they needed to reassess the foundation of our merger. Merger, Tamsin. She called my marriage a merger, and now she wants to back out because she thinks our family is shady. "And Dad thinks I planned this," I stated. It wasn't a question. "Of course you planned it," she shrieked. "You knew they watched that network. You positioned yourself right next to the general so you would be on camera. You were so jealous of my happiness, so bitter that Dad favors me, that you deliberately blew up my life right before my engagement party." I actually laughed. A dry, harsh sound that echoed in the empty office. Do? What on purpose? I didn't submit that photo. I don't even control what gets broadcasted by the press pool, Lorelei. That is not how any of this works. "Do not lie to me," she yelled. Suddenly, there was a scuffling sound on the other end of the line. A heavy hand grabbing the phone. "Tamsin." It was Harrison. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble, tight with a fury I had not heard in years. "Dad," I said coldly. "You listen to me, you vindictive, ungrateful wretch," he snarled. "I don't know who you slept with or who you manipulated to get into that briefing room, but you have humiliated me for the last time. You made me look like a fool in front of the most important people in this city. You made yourself look like a fool by lying about your own daughter," I shot back, the anger finally breaking through my calm facade. "You told them I was an unemployed nurse? Really? I protected our family image from your weird, secretive life," he shouted. "And now you are going to fix it? I have already drafted a statement. You are going to post a public apology on your social media, and you are going to write a letter to Octavia Thorne. You will tell her that you are a civilian contractor, a temp worker, and that you were seated in that chair by mistake before the real officers arrived. You will tell her I was telling the truth." I was stunned into silence. He wanted me to commit career suicide. He wanted me to falsely claim I was impersonating a senior officer, a federal offense, just to save his ego in front of a woman whose medical bid I was literally holding in my other hand. "You want me to lie to a defense contractor to cover up your insecurity?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "You owe this family," he roared. "You owe your sister. You will send that letter by tomorrow morning, or I swear to God, Tamsin, you are dead to me. You will never set foot in my house again." The line went dead. The silence in the office was deafening. I sat frozen, holding the phone away from my ear, staring at the blank screen. "You are dead to me." The words hung in the sterile air of the Pentagon, vibrating with the toxicity I had breathed in for my entire life. I looked down at my uniform hanging on the back of my door. I looked at the framed commendations on my wall. I looked at the red folder on my desk containing the Thorne Medical Group's desperate plea for $200 million. For 22 years, I had believed that if I just stayed quiet, if I just kept out of their way, the abuse would eventually stop. I thought that by making myself small, I was protecting the peace. But there was no peace. There was only a hostage situation, and I was the hostage. Harrison had just demanded I strip myself of my honor, my rank, and my truth to act as a human shield for his fragile vanity. He was willing to destroy my hard-earned career to secure a socialite wedding for the golden child. My phone dinged with a text message. It was from Lorelai. Cashin is furious. His mother is threatening to cancel the engagement party this Saturday. Dad is having palpitations. You need to send that letter to Octavia. And since you ruined the rehearsal dinner and traumatized me, Cashin, and I expect you to wire $100,000 to our wedding fund as honor compensation. Consider it your wedding gift, since you are banned from attending. Send it by tomorrow or we are done with you. $100,000. Honor compensation. I set the phone down. My hands were no longer shaking. A cold, absolute clarity washed over my brain, sharp and precise as a surgical scalpel. I was done. The reservoir of patience I had maintained for 2 decades evaporated in an instant, replaced by a glacial, unyielding resolve. They wanted to play a game of power and humiliation? They had no idea who they were playing with. I picked up my desk phone and dialed an internal extension. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Alastair, I said. Dr. Alastair was the former chief medical officer of the armed forces, a mentor who had guided me through my toughest deployments, and the closest thing I had to a real father. He was working late in the archives 2 floors down. Tamsin, it's late. Why aren't you at home drinking a terrible glass of wine? He asked, his voice warm with exhaustion. I need advice. Not strategic. Personal. I told him everything. I told him about the text message banning me from the party. I told him about the television broadcast, Harrison's lies, the demand for a fake apology, and the extortion text from Lorelai. I laid the ugly, broken pieces of my family on the table for the first time in my life. Alastair was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen the worst of human nature. You have spent your whole life absorbing their shrapnel, Tamsin, he said softly. You think being the bigger person means bleeding out quietly so they don't have to look at the mess. They stab you with the knife of silence, and they expect you to thank them for it. He wants me to erase myself, I whispered, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Let me ask you this, Colonel, Alastair said, his tone shifting to pure military authority. If an enemy combatant demanded you surrender your uniform and your honor, what would you do? I would destroy them. Exactly. Your father is not an enemy combatant, but he is an enemy of your spirit. Do not surrender. It is time to let them hear your thunder. Show them exactly who they banned from their little party. I hung up the phone. The ache beneath my ribs, the dull pain of rejection that had haunted me since childhood, was gone. In its place was a terrifying, beautiful strength. I turned my attention back to the Thorne Medical Group file. Octavia Thorne demanded honesty? Octavia Thorne hated liars? I grabbed my red pen. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I did not reply to Lorelai's demand for money. I did not draft a fake apology. I spent the next 4 hours ripping the Thorne Medical Group's bit apart piece by piece. When you know where to look, corporate deception is as obvious as a compound fracture. I cross-referenced their clinical trial data with off-book incident reports I pulled from our encrypted servers. I found the fatal flaw. The automated pressure sensors on their trauma pods, the exact mechanism supposed to keep a wounded soldier from bleeding to death, had a mechanical fault. In extreme heat, the sensors miscalculated blood pressure, releasing the tourniquets prematurely. Thorne Medical knew about it. They had buried the data behind layers of shell companies and fake lab results, rushing the product to secure the $200 million before they went bankrupt. It was not just corporate greed, it was criminal negligence. They were willing to let soldiers bleed out in the sand to save their stock price. And this was the empire Harrison was sacrificing me to impress. By 2 in the morning, I had compiled a devastating, irrefutable 30-page report. I stamped the front page with a heavy red ink seal, rejected, fraudulent data. Pending federal investigation. I saved the encrypted file and leaned back. The engagement party was this Saturday night. It was going to be held at the Thorne Estate, a sprawling mansion just outside Charlotte. All the elites would be there. The local politicians, the press, the wealthy socialites. Octavia Thorne would be holding court, waiting for the Monday morning call from the Pentagon that would save her company. I picked up my phone and called General Killian's direct emergency line. He is a man who sleeps 4 hours a night, and he answered on the first ring. "Griffin. Is there a crisis?" he asked, his voice gravelly but alert. "Yes, General. I have concluded my review of the Thorne medical contract. And? They are falsifying clinical data on the stabilization pods. The equipment is a death trap in high-heat environments. I have the proof." I heard him swear sharply under his breath. Those arrogant fools. If we had deployed those. "All right, Colonel. Send the report to the Inspector General immediately. I want their bid terminated, and I want them investigated by the DOJ by Monday." "Sir," I interjected, my heart hammering against my ribs, "I request permission to deliver the termination notice in person." "To the CEO, Octavia Thorne." General Killian paused. "In person? We usually handle this through legal channels, Griffin. Why the personal touch?" I took a deep breath. Octavia Thorne is hosting a massive society event this Saturday. My family will be there. My father has been lying to the Thornes, claiming I am a disgraced, unemployed nurse, to protect his image. They banned me from the event because they consider my existence an embarrassment. The Thornes are using my family, and my family is using the Thornes. I want to look Octavia Thorne in the eye when I tell her that the unemployed nurse she despises just killed her empire. Silence stretched over the line. I knew I was stepping out of bounds, mixing personal vendettas with military protocol. But General Killian is a man who understands honor, and he understands the sting of betrayal. I had saved his life in a dusty surgical tent in Kabul when a piece of shrapnel tore through his chest. He owed me nothing, but he respected me completely. "A society event, you say?" Killian mused, a dark amusement creeping into his voice. "You know, Colonel, I received an invitation to a Thorne family engagement party this Saturday. Octavia has been begging me to attend for 6 months to secure my favor for this very contract." My eyes widened. The pieces of the chessboard were aligning perfectly. "I was going to decline," Killian continued, "but it seems I have a sudden opening in my schedule. A commanding officer should always support his finest surgeons. Deliver the notice, Colonel. I will be there to back your play." "Thank you, sir." I hung up the phone. The trap was set. Harrison thought he could erase me. Lorelei thought she could extort me. Cashin thought he was marrying into a subservient family he could step all over. And Octavia Thorne thought she could cheat the United States military. They were all about to find out exactly who Tamsin Griffin was. I stood up from my desk. I walked over to the small closet in the corner of my office. Inside, hanging in a dry cleaning bag, was the pale blue, modest dress I had bought for the engagement party months ago. The dress I bought specifically to blend into the wallpaper, to make sure I did not outshine Lorelei. I pulled the dress off the hanger, walked over to the trash can, and threw it in. Then I reached to the very back of the closet. I pulled out my Class A dress uniform. The dark fabric was flawless. The brass buttons caught the dim light. I traced my fingers over the silver eagles on the epaulettes and the rows of colorful ribbons on the chest, the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Joint Service Commendation. Every piece of metal on that uniform was earned in blood, sweat, and absolute sacrifice. This was my skin. This was my truth. I packed the uniform into a garment bag. I had a flight to catch. It was time to go to a party. Thank you for watching until the end of part 2 of the story. If you're feeling excited and looking forward to the upcoming plot twist, please comment "I'm Win" below. This is a special sign for viewers who have watched this far. I will like and reply to all comments containing the keyword "I'm Win." Don't miss the next part. The Thorne estate was not just a house. It was a fortress of new money and old arrogance, situated on 50 acres of manicured rolling hills just outside the city limits. As my rental car tires crunched over the pristine white gravel of the winding driveway, I could see the grand mansion looming in the twilight. It looked like a luxury hotel. There were valet attendants in crisp white jackets running back and forth, parking a parade of imported sports cars and luxury sedans. Huge floral arrangements of white roses and orchids spilled over the stone balconies. A string quartet was playing somewhere in the background, the delicate notes floating on the warm evening breeze. I pulled my generic rental sedan up to the valet stand. The young attendant looked at my car, then looked at me through the window, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. I put the car in park, stepped out, and handed him the keys. I was wearing my Class A dress uniform. The deep green fabric was tailored perfectly to my frame. The brass buttons were polished to a mirror shine. The silver eagles of my colonel rank sat heavy on my shoulders, and the ribbons of my service, every deployment, every commendation, every life saved in the darkest corners of the earth, were pinned proudly to my chest. I wore my military cover, the formal hat sitting squarely on my head. I did not look like a tired trauma surgeon tonight. I looked like the wrath of God. I walked up the sweeping stone steps toward the massive double doors of the estate. 2 private security guards in dark suits were checking names on an iPad. "Name, ma'am?" the taller guard asked, his eyes darting to the medals on my chest with a sudden spark of respect. "Colonel Tamsin Griffin," I said, my voice steady. "I am the sister of the bride." He scrolled through his screen, frowned slightly, and scrolled again. "I apologize, Colonel. I am not seeing your name on the finalized guest list." "There has been an oversight," I said smoothly, holding his gaze. "My father, Harrison, is inside. You can let him know I have arrived, or I can walk in and find him myself. It is a family matter." The guard hesitated, looking at my uniform. Nobody wants to be the guy who turns away a decorated senior military officer from a family event. He stepped aside and opened the heavy oak door. "Go right in, Colonel." I stepped into the grand foyer. The ceiling was easily 30 feet high, dominated by a massive crystal chandelier that threw fractured light across the marble floor. Beyond the foyer, the main ballroom was packed with the elite of Charlotte. Politicians, wealthy investors, socialites dripping in diamonds. Waiters in black ties circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. I took off my cover, tucked it under my left arm according to regulation, and walked into the ballroom. It started as a ripple. The sight of a high-ranking military officer in full dress uniform walking into a high society engagement party is not something people ignore. Heads began to turn. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. The clinking of glasses slowed down. People parted to make way for me, their eyes dropping to the rows of ribbons on my chest, trying to calculate who I was and why I was there. I scanned the room. It did not take long to find them. Lorelei was standing near the center of the room, wearing a custom silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing, tossing her hair, clinging to the arm of Cashin Thorne. Cashin was wearing a velvet dinner jacket, holding a glass of scotch, looking bored and infinitely superior to everyone around him. A few feet away from them stood Harrison and Rowena. My father was holding a glass of champagne, nodding eagerly at something a wealthy-looking investor was saying, his face flushed with the desperate thrill of finally being accepted into the upper echelon. I walked straight toward them. The crowd parted around me like the Red Sea. Lorelei saw me first. Her laughter died in her throat. Her eyes went wide, fixing on my uniform, and the color drained instantly from her perfectly contoured face. She grabbed Cashin's arm, her fingernails digging into his velvet jacket. Cashin turned his head, following her gaze. He sneered. He did not know military ranks. He just saw a woman he had been told was a pathetic, unemployed embarrassment, daring to show up at his party in what he probably assumed was a costume. Then Harrison saw me. If I could have bottled the look on my father's face in that exact moment, I could have sold it as a cure for depression. The glass of champagne in his hand tilted, spilling expensive liquor onto his polished leather shoes. His jaw went slack. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, and the ghost was carrying a loaded weapon. I stopped 10 feet away from their little circle. The music seemed to fade away. The surrounding guests had formed a loose ring around us, sensing the sudden, sharp drop in atmospheric pressure. Cashin stepped forward, his lip curled in ultimate disdain. He looked me up and down, taking in the brass and the ribbons with a scoff. "What is this?" Cashin demanded, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Is this a joke? Where did you even rent this outfit? You are tracking dirt onto my mother's imported marble floors. Get out." I did not blink. I did not move. I just looked at him, dissecting his weak posture and fragile ego with the same cold precision I used in the trauma bay. Harrison lunged forward, his face flushed a dark, angry purple. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into my arm. "What are you doing here?" he hissed through clenched teeth, keeping his voice low but vibrating with rage. "I told you to stay away. I told you were an embarrassment. You are ruining everything. Get out of this house before I have you thrown out like a common trespasser." He tried to pull me toward the exit. I planted my feet, shifted my center of gravity, and yanked my arm out of his grasp with enough force to make him stumble backward. "Do not touch my uniform, Harrison," I said, my voice slicing through the air like a blade. Cashin took another step toward me, his face twisting with arrogant fury. "Are you deaf? You are a pathetic, unemployed nobody, and you are trespassing on Thorn property. Leave now, before my mother calls security and has you arrested." If someone insulted you in front of hundreds of people like that, what would you do? Slap him? Yell back? Run away crying? Let me know in the comments. Because what I did next made the entire room hold its breath. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I just waited. Because right at that moment, the massive double doors of the ballroom swung open again. The heavy doors slammed open with a definitive thud that echoed off the high ceilings. A new voice rang out from the foyer, loud, booming, and carrying the unmistakable authority of a man used to commanding thousands. I hardly think having a decorated war hero arrested is a good look for a company seeking federal contracts, Mr. Thorne. The crowd parted instantly. Striding into the ballroom was General Killian. He was in his own dress uniform, the 3 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders. He was flanked by 2 stern-faced military aides. The general possessed a physical presence that demanded total submission. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The wealthy socialites and local politicians recognized him immediately. General Killian was a titan in Washington. He was the exact man Octavia Thorne had been desperately trying to court for 6 months. From the far side of the room, Octavia Thorne came pushing through the crowd. She was a striking woman in her 60s, wearing a severe black gown and a diamond necklace that could fund a small hospital. Her eyes lit up with predatory triumph the moment she saw the general. She shoved past a waiter, ignoring her son and my father entirely, and rushed toward Killian with both hands extended, a massive, practiced smile plastered across her face. "General Killian." Octavia gushed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What an unbelievable honor. We were not sure you were going to make it. Welcome to our home. Please, let me introduce you to my husband and my son Cashin, the groom-to-be." General Killian did not take her hands. He did not even look at her. He walked right past Octavia Thorne as if she were a piece of inconvenient furniture. He walked directly toward me. The entire ballroom was paralyzed. Harrison was staring at the general, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Lorelei was shaking, hiding behind Cashin. General Killian stopped 2 paces in front of me. He snapped his boots together with a sharp crack that echoed in the silent room. He stood at perfect attention, raised his right hand, and delivered a crisp, flawless military salute. "Good evening, Colonel Griffin," the general said, his voice ringing out loud and clear for every single person in the room to hear. Or should I say, Chief Medical Strategic Advisor. I returned the salute, my movements precise. "Good evening, sir. Thank you for coming." Killian dropped his hand and finally turned to face the crowd. He looked at Cashin, who was currently staring at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Then the general looked at Octavia, who had frozen mid-step, her hands still hovering in the air. "Mrs. Thorne," General Killian said, his tone dangerously polite. "I believe you were just about to have my chief advisor thrown out." I must advise against that. Colonel Griffin is not only the most brilliant trauma surgeon the United States Army has produced in a decade, she is also the woman who pulled a piece of enemy shrapnel out of my chest wall in Kabul. The general tapped the left side of his chest. I owe her my life. And more importantly to you, she is the sole authority reviewing your $200 million medical equipment bid. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. You could hear the soft humming of the air conditioning vents. You could hear the ice melting in the unattended glasses. I watched the truth detonate in the center of the room. I watched Octavia Thorne's brain process the information. The woman she had thought was a pathetic temp worker, the sister she had allowed her son to mock, the woman her future in-laws had banned from the party to save face, was a senior military commander. And not just any commander. She was the exact person holding the keys to the Thorne Empire's financial survival. Octavia's face turned the color of ash. Her eyes darted from the general, to my silver eagles, and finally to my father, Harrison. Harrison looked like he was going to have a stroke. His skin was gray, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. His hands were trembling so violently he dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, but nobody moved. For 22 years, he had lied about me to protect his fragile ego. He had shrunk me down to fit his narrative. Now his lie was laid bare in front of the richest, most powerful people he knew, and the consequences were staring him right in the face. Lorelei let out a small, whimpering sound and took a step back, knocking into a cocktail table. "Wait," Cashin stammered, all his previous arrogance evaporating into thin air. He looked at his mother, panic setting in. "Mom, what is he talking about? You said she was an unemployed nurse." Harrison said she was a temp. Octavia Thorne turned her gaze slowly toward Harrison. If looks could incinerate, my father would have been reduced to a pile of carbon right then and there. "Harrison," Octavia said, her voice dropping into a terrifying, lethal whisper. "You looked me in the eye at dinner last night and swore to me that your daughter was a civilian. You told me she was an embarrassment." Harrison held his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Octavia, please, you have to understand. I did not know. She keeps secrets. She never tells us anything. I had no idea she was a colonel. Tamsin, please tell them." He turned to me, his eyes wide and frantic, begging me to save him. I looked at the man who had texted me to stay away just 48 hours ago. I looked at the man who had skipped my medical school graduation for a ballet recital, who had stolen my life savings to fund his favorite daughter's vanity project. "Do not speak to me," I said evenly. "You lost the right to ask for my help the moment you told me I was dead to you." The social elite of Charlotte thrives on gossip, but they had never witnessed a public execution quite like this. Octavia Thorne realized her company was slipping through her fingers. The $200 million contract was the only thing standing between the Thorne Medical Group and total bankruptcy. She went into survival mode. She needed a scapegoat, and she found two immediately. She spun around and faced her son. Cashin shrank back, but he was not fast enough. Octavia raised her hand and slapped Cashin across the face. The sharp smack echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Cashin staggered backward, holding his cheek, his eyes watering in shock. "You stupid, arrogant boy," Octavia hissed, her veneer of high society elegance shattering completely. "You just insulted a decorated colonel of the United States military in our home. Apologize to her this instant." Cashin, trembling, turned toward me. I am sorry. I did not know." "Save it," I cut him off, my voice cold. Octavia then turned her wrath on Harrison. She stepped right into his personal space, pointing a manicured finger directly at his chest. "And you pathetic, lying fraud. You brought this disaster into my home. You lied about your own flesh and blood to climb the social ladder. You are a disgusting, small man. The wedding is off. There will be no merger between our families. I want you and your ridiculous, vapid daughter out of my house immediately." Lorelei burst into loud, ugly tears. She grabbed Harrison's arm, sobbing hysterically. "Dad, do something. She is canceling my wedding. Tamsin ruined everything. Make her fix it." Harrison looked at me, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes. He actually fell to his knees on the marble floor right in front of me, ignoring the gasps from the surrounding crowd. "Tamsin, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. Just tell them you will approve the contract. Save your sister's wedding. Do this one thing for your family. I will make it up to you, I swear. I will tell everyone how proud I am of you." I looked down at him. For decades, I had yearned for his approval. I would have moved mountains for one kind word from this man. But seeing him now, groveling on the floor, willing to trade his own dignity for a defense contract, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just a profound, liberating emptiness. "You do not have a family, Harrison," I said quietly, making sure every word landed with devastating precision. "You have a PR campaign. And tonight, your campaign went bankrupt." I looked up from my weeping father and locked eyes with Octavia Thorne. She was watching me with a desperate, hungry look, hoping my rejection of my father meant I was willing to do business with her. "Colonel Griffin," Octavia said, trying to regain her composure, forcing a tight, nervous smile. "It seems we have been the victims of a terrible misunderstanding caused by a deceitful man. But we are professionals. Regarding the medical contract, I assure you, Thorne Medical provides the finest stabilization pods on the market. We can sit down on Monday, just you and I, and clear this all up." I did not smile back. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my uniform jacket. I pulled out the heavy, folded document I had finalized at 2 in the morning. I held it up so the overhead chandelier illuminated the bright red stamp on the front page. "Rejected. Fraudulent data. Pending federal investigation." Octavia's eyes locked onto the red ink, and the remaining color drained from her face. She stopped breathing. "There is no misunderstanding, Mrs. Thorne," I said, my voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a final verdict. "I spent last night reviewing your clinical data. You falsified the temperature stress tests. Your automated tourniquet sensors fail in high heat environments. You are willing to sell defective medical equipment to the military and let our soldiers bleed out in the desert, just to inflate your stock price." Gasps erupted from the surrounding crowd. The politicians and investors began muttering rapidly to one another, pulling out their phones. The Thorne reputation was actively disintegrating in real time. I tossed the heavy document. It landed with a loud smack right on the cocktail table in front of Octavia. "Your bid is permanently rejected," I stated clearly. "And as of this morning, General Killian has authorized the Department of Justice to open a federal investigation into your corporate fraud. By Monday, your stock will be worthless." Octavia Thorne stumbled backward, clutching her diamond necklace, her mouth opening in a silent scream of financial agony. She looked at the report, then at the general, and finally at me, realizing she had been completely and utterly destroyed. "As for my family," I said, looking down at Harrison, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping openly, and Lorelei, who had collapsed into a chair in hysterics. I looked back at Octavia. "You can keep them. You deserve each other. You all share the same fatal flaw. You think the truth does not apply to you." I adjusted my cover, placing it perfectly on my head. I looked at General Killian and gave a brief nod. "We are done here, General." "Indeed we are, Colonel," Killian replied, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He turned, and the 2 military aides cleared a path. I walked out of the Thorne mansion the same way I walked in, head held high, back straight, my boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. I did not look back at the chaos I left behind. I did not look back at the wailing sister, the broken father, or the ruined corporate empire. I walked out into the cool night air, the heavy weight of 22 years of trauma lifting off my shoulders and scattering into the wind. The fallout was rapid, merciless, and heavily televised. By Tuesday morning, the national news networks were running the story. Defense contractor investigated for fraudulent military bids. The Thorne Medical Group's stock plummeted by 70% in a single afternoon. Investors pulled out. Board members resigned. Federal agents raided their corporate headquarters, seizing servers and hard drives. Octavia Thorne was facing federal indictments for fraud and criminal negligence. The Thorne empire, built on generations of arrogance and cutting corners, collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Naturally, the engagement was cancelled. Cash and Thorne, terrified of being associated with a family that had brought this disaster upon them, publicly dumped Lorelai. He changed the locks on their shared apartment and sent her belongings to my parents' house in garbage bags. But the destruction did not stop there. Octavia Thorne, facing prison time and financial ruin, needed someone to punish. She aimed all her remaining resources at Harrison. She sued his insurance agency for breach of contract on a minor policy he had handled for them years ago. She used her high-priced lawyers to tie him up in litigation, bleeding his finances dry. The country club friends who had eagerly attended the engagement party suddenly stopped returning Harrison's calls. Nobody wanted to be associated with a man who had lied about his daughter to a federal investigator or a family that had been publicly humiliated by the Pentagon. Harrison's insurance agency lost its major clients. Within 3 weeks, he was forced to file for bankruptcy. His luxury car was repossessed. The pristine suburban house was put up for sale. I watched the news from the quiet sanctuary of my Washington, D.C. apartment. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I simply drank my coffee, went to the Pentagon, and continued saving lives. My world had returned to its demanding, purposeful rhythm. The toxicity was gone. Exactly 1 month after the party, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, the buzzer to my apartment building rang. I pressed the intercom button. Yes, Tamsin, it is us. The voice was small, cracked, and heavily aged. It was Harrison. I hesitated. My first instinct was to press the disconnect button and walk away. But a part of me, the part that required total closure to move on, knew I had to finish this. Come up, I said. I unlocked my front door and waited. A few moments later, the elevator chimed. Harrison and Rowena walked down the hallway. I barely recognized them. Harrison looked like he had aged 10 years in a month. He was wearing a wrinkled coat, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow and defeated. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded I erase myself was gone. In his place was a broken, frightened old man. Rowena looked pale and exhausted, her usual facade of forced cheerfulness entirely wiped away. They stepped into my apartment. It was the first time they had ever visited me in Washington. They stood in the entryway, looking around. My home is not a mansion, but it is a reflection of my life. The walls are lined with framed medical degrees, letters of commendation from the president, and photographs of me standing with Allied commanders in various countries. It is a monument to a life of consequence. Harrison stared at a framed photograph of me receiving the Bronze Star. His hands began to tremble. He slowly turned to face me. We lost the house, Tamsin, he whispered, his voice breaking. Octavia ruined us. Lorelai is living in our basement. She will not stop crying. My business is gone. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, holding a mug of tea. I did not offer them a seat. Actions have consequences, Harrison. You bet your entire life on a fraudulent family, and you lost. Rowena stepped forward, tears spilling down her cheeks. Tamsin, please. We have nothing left. We are your parents. You make a good salary. You have all these connections. We need a place to stay. We need your help to get back on our feet. I looked at my mother. The woman who had watched her husband emotionally abuse me for 2 decades and did nothing but pass the potatoes. You need my help? I asked, my voice calm but laced with ice. The same help I needed when I was drowning in medical school debt? The same help I needed when you stole my $50,000 to fund Lorelai's failed business? The same help I needed when you texted me to stay away because I was an embarrassment. Harrison collapsed onto my living room sofa. He put his face in his hands and began to weep. It was not the performative crying he had done at the Thorne estate. This was the deep, guttural sobbing of a man who realized he had destroyed his own life. I was wrong, Harrison choked out, tears running down his weathered face. I was so wrong, Tamsin. I was intimidated by you. I was scared of you because you did not need me. Lorelai needed me. She made me feel important. You built this incredible life, and you did it without my money or my advice. It made me feel small. So I tried to make you small. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for all the years I stole from you. Please forgive me. He looked up at me, his eyes begging for absolution. He wanted the movie ending. He wanted the moment where the prodigal father apologizes, the daughter cries, they hug, and everything is magically repaired. He wanted me to write him a check and let him live in my guest room. I walked over to the coffee table and stood directly in front of him. I looked down at the weeping man who had haunted my insecurities for a lifetime. You are not crying because you realize you are a bad father, I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through his sobs like a surgical laser. You are crying because your golden child did not marry a billionaire. You are crying because you are broke. And you are crying because the powerful people you spent your whole life worshipping turn out to work for me. Harrison flinched as if I had struck him. No, Tamsin, I swear, stop, I commanded. He snapped his mouth shut instantly. You do not want to apologize to Tamsin, I continued, staring into his hollow eyes. Tamsin is the daughter you left standing alone at graduation. Tamsin is the daughter whose life savings you stole. You threw Tamsin in the garbage a long time ago. You are sitting on my couch right now trying to apologize to the colonel. You are apologizing to my paycheck. You are apologizing to my influence. And I am not buying it. Rowena gasped, covering her mouth. Tamsin, how can you be so cruel? We are family. I turned my gaze to her. Family? A family protects each other. A family does not demand that a daughter commit a federal crime by writing a fake apology to a defense contractor just to save a dinner party. A family does not extort $100,000 in honor compensation for existing. You are not my family. You are just two people who share my DNA and a mountain of regret. I walked over to the front door and opened it wide. The cold air from the hallway blew in. I am not going to ruin you, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Octavia Thorne already did that. But I am not going to save you either. You made your choices for 22 years. Now you get to live with them. I want you out of my home. I want you to lose my phone number. If you ever contact me again, I will have military police issue a restraining order. Harrison stood up slowly. He looked at the open door, then looked at me. The last shred of his ego died in that living room. He finally realized that the bridge was not just burned, the ashes had been scattered into the ocean. There was no going back. He took Rowena's arm. They walked slowly toward the door, two broken ghosts dragging the weight of their own arrogance behind them. As Harrison crossed the threshold, he stopped and looked back at me one last time. I am sorry, he whispered to the empty air. Goodbye, Harrison, I said. I closed the door. I heard the lock click into place. It was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I walked over to the large window of my apartment, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline. The rain was washing the streets clean. The heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest since I was a child was entirely gone. I breathed in, filling my lungs with air that finally belonged only to me. I did not break them. I simply stopped being their shield and let the reality of their own actions crush them. I had spent my life searching for a family, only to realize I had already built one. My family was Dr. Alistair, who checked on me every week. My family was General Killian, who stood by my side in a room full of enemies. My family was the men and women I served with, who measured worth by integrity, not by bank accounts. I took my uniform out of the closet, inspecting the brass buttons, brushing a speck of dust off the silver eagles. I hung it carefully. Tomorrow, I would put it on again. Tomorrow, I would go back to work, saving lives, protecting the people who actually mattered. I was no longer the embarrassed daughter hiding in the shadows. I was the architect of my own destiny. Some people say I was too cruel to ruin my in-laws' contract and push my family into a dead end. But I wonder, if I didn't have power, would they ever have shown me any respect? Was I wrong to refuse my father's belated apology? If it were you, what would you do? Thank you for listening to my story today. If you've ever had to fight alone in your own home, remember, you're not alone. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in the next stories.